The Jeffersonian Era, the time period that encompasses the Thomas Jefferson Presidency, which is 1801 through 1809. Starting out here during Jefferson's first term, he attempted to win the allegiance of his Federalist opponents. Remember, he is a Democratic Republican, and the Federalists had been in power before the election of 1800 when he became president, and several of his Democratic Republican colleagues won the houses of Congress. So he tried to win the allegiance of his Federalist opponents when he became president by keeping the national bank and the debt repayment plan that Hamilton had set forth during his time as Washington's Secretary of the Treasury. Now, in foreign policy, he carried on the neutrality policies of Washington and Adams, which says a lot because it was Washington's neutrality policy towards France in the French Revolution that made Jefferson resign from Washington's cabinet in 1793. So now here in 1801, he's changed his heart and is a neutrality guy as well. However, to please his Democratic Republican supporters, he did reduce the size of the military. He eliminated several federal jobs, and he also repealed excise taxes. Essentially, he was more of a small government guy. Back then, the Federalist Party was more about a large government, and the Democratic Republicans were about a small government. And that debate still continues to this day. The Louisiana Purchase was one of the most consequential parts of his presidency. It did take place in his first term, and the Louisiana Territory was this vast, largely unexplored landmass that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. So basically, the middle third of what is now the continental United States was known as the Louisiana Territory, named after King Louis XIV, who funded explorations into the New World in the 17th and 18th centuries. Some of the most valuable parts of the Louisiana Territory were the Port of New Orleans and the Missouri River. The Port of New Orleans at the southern tip of that vast territory, and then the Missouri River that kind of cut through the center of it. Now, for years, this land had been claimed by Spain ever since the Treaty of Paris of 1763 that ended the French and Indian War. That land was taken from France and given to the Spanish. But then in the year 1800, the new French leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had come to power the previous year in 1799, he reclaimed the Louisiana Territory for France. It was a quiet agreement that he negotiated the Spanish to cede that land to the French. And Napoleon hoped to restore the French Empire in the Americas, the empire that France had before the French and Indian War had taken away all of their land except for Haiti. But by 1803, things had changed. By 1803, Napoleon had lost his interest in the plan of resurrecting the French Empire in the Americas, and instead had become focused solely on his empire in Europe. And there were several reasons why he had lost interest in the Louisiana Territory. First, he needed to concentrate French resources on fighting England. That was his main priority, and the Louisiana Territory was taking some resources away from him. Secondly, there was a rebellion known as the Haitian Revolution, led by Toussaint Louverture, against French rule in Haiti. This was essentially a slave revolt that resulted in the French getting defeated and getting kicked off the island of Hispaniola, and Haiti becoming an independent nation, the first black-led nation in the New World. And this resulted in heavy French losses. So basically, Napoleon needed money. He did not really need the Louisiana Territory anymore, but instead needed cash in order to fight his wars in Europe. Now, the U.S. had gained access to the Port of New Orleans several years before with the Pinckney Treaty. If you remember from last lecture, the Pinckney Treaty of 1795, that is when the Spanish they got a little nervous from the Jay Treaty of the previous year, 1794, and they were afraid that America was becoming too cozy with the British. And therefore, with the Pinckney Treaty, the Spanish gave America access to the Port of New Orleans and the entire lower Mississippi River. But then in 1802, during Jefferson's first term, the Spanish officials who still controlled the Port of New Orleans, they completely revoked that access, which had previously been given to America, and this really hindered American trade. The people who suffered the worst from this were those on the western frontier, places like Kentucky and Illinois and Tennessee. They suffered the most from this decline in trade that resulted from it, and they really clamored for some government action. They said the government needed to do something in order to restore these lands, in order to restore access to the port, I should say, to the U.S. So Thomas Jefferson sent ministers to France. He sent several American delegates to France with instructions to offer up to $10 million for the city of New Orleans and a small strip of land coming out of New Orleans. Not really all that much territory, basically just a city and its surrounding land. But then Napoleon's ministers in France, who met with Jefferson's ministers, they were seeking funds for a war against Britain. And as I said, Napoleon had lost interest in the Louisiana territory, so they offered to sell not only New Orleans, but also the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. Now, $15 million is certainly more than I've ever seen in my life, but if you divide it by the acreage that they got, it was 3 cents per acre. Jefferson and most Americans strongly approved of this agreement, and it more than doubled the size of the United States. It removed a foreign presence from the nation's borders, and it guaranteed the U.S. The extension of our western frontier to lands beyond the Mississippi River. Also, acquiring millions of acres of land at such a cheap cost, this aligned with Jefferson's vision for America's future. Remember, Hamilton wanted America to have an industrial future, but Jefferson wanted America to have an agrarian future. He wanted a society of yeomen or independent farmers, and the fact that you now have so much rich farmland that people can settle, that really aligned with his vision for the nation's future. The Louisiana Purchase increased Jefferson's popularity, and it also led to the permanent decline of the Federalist Party because the Federalists were largely against the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson persuaded Congress to fund an exploration of the West to be led by Captain Meriwether Lewis, who was his personal secretary, and Lieutenant William Clark, who was chosen by Lewis to be his companion on this journey. So Lewis and Clark set out from St. Louis with several dozen frontiersmen from the Illinois, Kentucky regions, and they had trained in a fort near St. Louis, and then they set sail from St. Louis in 1804. They traveled up the Missouri River against the current. It was very difficult traveling, but they managed it. They then crossed the Rockies and reached the Oregon coast on the Pacific Ocean by way of the Columbia River. They then returned and completed their journey in 1806. They had been gone for 2 full years. Only one person died on the entire journey, even though it was a very dangerous journey. And he had died of appendicitis. So it was of natural causes there. This expedition connected Americans to Native American tribes, the Shoshone, the Sioux, the Mandan, several others, the Nez Perce, the Blackfeet. All of those Indian tribes came into contact with Lewis and Clark's expedition. And one woman in particular played a very large role named Sacagawea, where she and her small child, her son, accompanied Lewis and Clark starting in the Dakotas and then moving westward. And she was a presence that really communicated the peaceful intentions of Lewis and Clark. They weren't there to make war or conquer or force Indians to do anything or go anywhere. They were there to explore, to discover, to make scientific journal entries in order to study the flora and fauna of the region. And this is exactly what they did. This strengthened U.S. claims to the Oregon Territory. It improved relations with Indian tribes for the most part. It developed maps and land routes for fur trappers and future settlers. William Clark was the map guy, and Meriwether Lewis was the scientific guy who would write about the different plants and crops that they saw along the way. So this really increased geographic and scientific knowledge of previously unexplored country, and very much set the stage for America to eventually expand from one ocean to the next. Another major part of Jefferson's presidency what occurred with the Supreme Court. So John Marshall was appointed by John Adams as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he was one of the most consequential justices in all of Supreme Court history. Very intelligent, very competent, and he served for 34 years. He very much shaped the Supreme Court in much the same way that Washington shaped the presidency. Marshall and other justices in the Supreme Court and the other federal judiciaries were mostly Federalists, and these were really the only Federalists who were left in power. The Democratic-Republican Party had entirely usurped their control of the other branches of government, but because the courts were largely run by Federalists, Jefferson became very annoyed with them, very frustrated with the way that they interpreted the Constitution, and therefore he saw them as a roadblock and he wanted them out. And so he searched the Constitution for some ways he might be able to rid the government of these pesky Federalists. So he led efforts to impeach and remove several Federalist judges. Some were removed successfully, but overall the effort was unsuccessful and kind of hindered credibility between the branches there. Now, immediately before leaving office, John Adams had appointed a Federalist judge named William Marbury. This was in the final days of his presidency, after Jefferson had already won the election, but while he was waiting to take office. And when Jefferson did take office a few days later, he ordered Secretary of State James Madison to block the appointment of William Marbury. Now, he asked him to block this appointment and other last-minute appointments that Adams had made. His logic was that I'm the president now. Adams only made these appointments as he was on his way out. He shouldn't have had the right to do that, so I should be able to shape the court how I see fit. But then William Marbury, he sued the federal government. He said that he should be allowed to keep his appointment regardless of who the president is, because when Adams appointed him, Adams was president. In the Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Marbury did have a right to his appointment according to an act passed by Congress in 1789 called the Judiciary Act of Congress. So John Marshall stated that it was lawful for Marbury to keep his appointment, but Marshall then stated that this law, the Judiciary Act of Congress, was unconstitutional, which means it contradicted the Constitution. And therefore, Marshall overturned that law, the Judiciary Act of Congress, and therefore denied Marbury his appointment. So this was huge because this set the precedent of what's called judicial review. And from this point forward, the Supreme Court had the authority to determine whether an act of Congress or an act of the president was constitutional. And they held the authority to overturn laws and to overrule actions of the two other branches. So this very much expanded the power of the Supreme Court, and this is still something they do today. All right, one of the villains, really, of the Jeffersonian era was Aaron Burr, and there were a lot of things wrong with him, a lot of immoralities and flaws in his character. But he was the vice president throughout Jefferson's first term. In fact, he had run for president in 1800 against Jefferson and very, very narrowly lost to him. And at the time, the law was that whoever comes in second in the election becomes vice president. So Aaron Burr was Jefferson's VP during his first term, but he was not renominated to be Jefferson's VP for his second term. By this point in 1804, the laws had changed to where you could choose your own running mate. And when Burr was kind of given the shaft here, he was very bitter about this. And so he conspired with a group of radical New England Federalists. And his plan was to win the governorship of New York. And then he wanted to unite New York with the New England states. Then his plan was to lead this group of states to secede from the Union, to break apart from America, and to form its own country. However, he lost this election, and so the conspiracy died off. Again, in 1804, the same year that he tried to become governor of New York and break apart from America, he also killed Alexander Hamilton. He was angered by an insulting remark that had been attributed to Hamilton. We don't know if he actually said it, but Burr challenged him to a duel. Now, duels had been very much looked down upon as murderous, because in a duel you take turns shooting at each other, or you both shoot at the same time. And a lot of times, a gentleman, if he was challenged to a duel, in order to keep his pride, he would accept the duel, but then he would shoot the gun into the air so as not to kill him. So he proved he wasn't a coward, but then wouldn't kill anybody. And that's what Alexander Hamilton did. But then when it was Burr's turn to shoot, he shot straight at Hamilton and killed him. Then in 1806, Burr plotted again. He planned to take Mexico from Spain and then unite it with the Louisiana Territory and make himself the leader of it. Jefferson then arrested him for treason, but he was found not guilty by the courts. The Barbary Wars were another hallmark of the Jefferson presidency. Now, Jefferson tried to avoid war. He sought to maintain US neutrality in the face of these increasing provocations from both France and Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. But the first challenge to this peace treaty did not come from France or Britain. It actually came from a group of pirates who were plying the seas of the Mediterranean off of the North African coast. And these pirates came from what were called the Barbary states, which were basically provinces or colonies of the Ottoman Empire. Now, to protect U.S. merchant ships from being seized by Barbary pirates, which is what was happening during the early 1800s, the late 1700s, Presidents Washington and Adams had reluctantly agreed to pay tribute to the Barbary governments in order to trade in the Mediterranean. They kind of appeased them in that way and said, okay, if we pay you tribute, will you promise not to take over our ships and kill or impress our sailors? And they said, yeah. Now, one ruler of the state, the Pasha of Tripoli, he demanded a higher sum in tribute when Jefferson took office. He thought he could take advantage of the transfer of power, and he then required a larger sum from America in order to avoid piracy. But rather than pay this sum, Jefferson decided that we were going to have a show of strength. He sent a small fleet of U.S. naval vessels into the Mediterranean, and what ensued was called the Barbary Wars. And this lasted for about 4 years. It was sporadic fighting from time to time. You had Barbary ships and American ships firing upon each other, largely with the state of Tripoli. And this was from 1801 to 1805. So this really encompassed Jefferson's first term. Now, the American Navy did not achieve a decisive victory in this war, but they did gain some respect for kind of standing up to the Barbary pirates and not just paying the ever-increasing sum for tribute. And this also offered a measure of protection to U.S. vessels trading in Mediterranean waters, because pirates knew that there would be consequences if they tried to rob our ships and impress our sailors. Now, meanwhile, the Napoleonic Wars, the wars that Napoleon was instigating, invading all sorts of regions of Europe, these continued to dominate the politics of Europe, and because of that, it dominated the commercial economy of the U.S., because France and Britain were attempting to use their navies to put blockades around their enemies' ports. And these were ports that America sailed in and out of in order to trade. And the French and the British would seize ships of neutral nations like America and confiscate all their cargo. So this was a devastating blow to the U.S. economy. Now, Britain was the greatest offender in the Atlantic specifically, and one thing they did is they even captured U.S. sailors and impressed them. Now, I've used that term a couple times. To impress means to force the sailors on that ship into service in your own navy. So the British would sail up to an American ship, they would seize the ship and force the U.S. sailors into service in the British Navy. Now, one incident at sea almost led to war, and that was called the Chesapeake-Leopard Affair. This was in 1807, so we're in Jefferson's second term at this point, and it took place several miles off the coast of Virginia. The British warship called the Leopard fired upon the U.S. warship, the Chesapeake, and in this exchange of cannon fire, 3 Americans were killed and 4 others were taken captive and impressed into the British Navy, and Americans were outraged by this. You have this big anti-British fervor running high in America, the fact that they did this to one of our ships, and many Americans demanded war, saying, we need to go to war with England again. We beat them once, we can beat them again. And Jefferson however, resorted to diplomacy and economic pressure as his response to this crisis of British impressment, which would continue to be a problem, and that's a big reason why the War of 1812 was fought, which we'll talk about in the next video. The Embargo Act of 1807 prohibited American merchant ships from sailing into any foreign port. And since the U.S. was Britain's largest trading partner, Jefferson hoped that the British would stop violating the rights of neutral nations rather than lose U.S. trade. But instead what happened was that this really backfired, and it hurt the American economy terribly and didn't really hurt the British economy that much. It brought a lot of economic hardship to the U.S. because we couldn't trade with Britain, who was one of our biggest trading partners. And the British were determined to control the seas at all costs. And so they replaced U.S. imports with South American imports. They said, fine, we can go somewhere else to get what we usually get from you. And the U.S. just plunged into a massive depression, especially in the shipbuilding and merchant regions like New England. And New Englanders even threatened to secede from the Union because of the economic strain that was placed on them by the Embargo Act. Finally, in 1809, Jefferson repealed the Embargo Act in the final days of his presidency. So final thing here, Jefferson followed the tradition established by Washington by voluntarily retiring from the presidency after a second term. And this is something that continued for many presidents after him. Now, for his party's nomination as president, for the Democratic-Republican Party's nomination, Jefferson supported his close friend, his Secretary of State, James Madison. And in 1808, James Madison won the election and became the fourth president in March of 1809.